Hey, stop scrolling for a second. Picture this. 40 floors up, no walls yet, just steel and wind and a woman in a blue gown screaming, "Don't let her fall," except she's the one who pushed her. A maid in a pink uniform is falling backward off the edge of a skyscraper. A billionaire in a black suit is lunging too far away, his voice breaking apart in the wind. And in half a second, everything he thought he knew about the woman he was about to marry is going to shatter right along with whatever happens next. I promise you, you will not see this twist coming. Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from and which country you belong to. I love reading where this story finds you. Today's story is about loyalty, hidden truth, and the kind of betrayal that hides behind a smile for years before it finally shows its face. Stay with me till the end, because what this maid did next changed a billionaire's entire life. Let's get into it. Nobody at Meridian Tower expected the day to end with a scream 40 stories in the air. Nathaniel Calloway was 34 years old, and by every outward measure, he had everything a man could want. He was the CEO of Calloway Group, one of the largest real estate development firms on the East Coast, and Meridian Tower, the glass spire currently rising over the city skyline, was going to be his crowning achievement. His father had started the company from a single construction crew in the 70s. Nathaniel had spent his entire adult life trying to prove he deserved to carry that name. He also had a fiancée, Vivian Hale, 30 years old, stunning, magnetic, the kind of woman who walked into a room and made every conversation quieter. They'd been engaged for 4 months. The wedding was being planned by a coordinator Vivian had flown in from Manhattan, and the engagement shoot, today's shoot, on the open top floor of Meridian Tower, 42 stories above the city with no windows installed yet, just steel beams and a view that stretched to the harbor, had been Vivian's idea. "It's dramatic," she'd said. "It's us standing above the whole world. People will talk about it for years." What nobody had accounted for was Marisol Vega. Marisol was 34, the same age as Nathaniel, though their lives could not have looked more different. She'd worked in the Calloway household for 3 years, first as part of the housekeeping staff and over time, quietly without ever asking for it, she'd become something closer to the person who kept Nathaniel's entire life running. She remembered his father's birthday when Nathaniel forgot it. She noticed when he hadn't eaten in 14 hours because he was buried in blueprints. She was the one who found him once, sitting alone in his father's old office at 2 a.m., staring at a photograph, not saying a word, and she'd simply sat down across from him and stayed until he was ready to talk. She had a 9-year-old son, Mateo, who she was raising alone in a small apartment 40 minutes outside the city. She worked long hours so he could go to a decent school. She had never once, in 3 years, complained about any of it. Vivian hated her. Not loudly. Not in any way anyone could point to and call proof. It was in the small things, the way Vivian's eyes tracked Marisol across a room, the way she'd correct Marisol's English in front of guests even when nothing was wrong, the way she once accidentally had Marisol's belongings moved out of the staff quarters and into storage while Marisol was picking Mateo up from school. Nathaniel noticed none of it. He was a good man, but like a lot of good men who've been rich their whole lives, he had a blind spot exactly the size and shape of his own household staff. That morning, the photographer had set up on the raw concrete of the 42nd floor. Steel beams rose overhead like the ribs of something enormous. The wind-up there was different than at street level, colder, more insistent, carrying the sound of construction crews working 2 floors below. Vivian had chosen a sapphire blue gown for the shoot, something with a slit up the leg and a train that moved like water when she walked. Nathaniel wore a charcoal suit. They looked, the photographer kept saying, like something out of a magazine. Marisol wasn't supposed to be there at all. She'd come up on Nathaniel's instruction, actually. He'd asked her to bring up a folder of documents from his site office that his lawyer needed signed before the end of the day, contracts related to the tower's final inspection sign-offs. It was supposed to take 90 seconds. Walk up, hand him the folder, walk back down. She stepped off the construction elevator into the open floor, folder in hand, and the first thing she saw was Vivian's face change. It wasn't jealousy over Nathaniel. Not in that moment anyway. It was something else. Something colder. Because tucked into the folder Marisol was carrying, visible at the edge where the top page had slipped, was a document Marisol had found the day before while organizing files in Nathaniel's home office. A document with Vivian's name on it. A document that had absolutely nothing to do with tower inspections. Marisol hadn't said a word about it to anyone yet. She'd only meant to bring the folder up, hand it over, and figure out later privately whether what she'd read meant what she thought it meant. But Vivian saw the edge of that page. And Vivian knew exactly what it was. "What is that?" Vivian said. Not a question. A demand, quiet and sharp, cutting clean through the wind noise. Marisol felt her stomach drop the way it does right before you understand you've made a mistake you can't take back. "It's for Mr. Calloway's lawyer," she said carefully. "Site inspection paperwork. Give me the folder." Nathaniel, 20 feet away, laughing at something the photographer had said, hadn't even turned around yet. He had no idea the ground beneath this entire relationship had just started to crack. "Vivian," Marisol started. "Give me the folder, Marisol." Vivian's voice had climbed half an octave, and now Nathaniel did turn, frowning, starting to walk toward them, the photographer lowering his camera in confusion. And that was when Vivian crossed the space between them in 3 fast strides, grabbed for the folder, and Marisol instinctively pulled it back and away from her, toward the open edge of the floor where the safety railing hadn't been installed yet, where there was nothing between the concrete and 42 stories of empty air but a strip of yellow caution tape that meant nothing at all against the force of 2 women fighting over a piece of paper. "Vivian, what are you doing?" Nathaniel's voice, closer now, sharp with alarm. Vivian shoved. It wasn't a small push. It wasn't an accident born of a scuffle. Later, much later, when Marisol replayed it in her mind 100 times, she would remember with absolute clarity that Vivian's hands had found her shoulders and driven forward with everything she had, and that in the half-second before her feet left solid ground, she saw something in Vivian's eyes that had nothing to do with a folder of paperwork at all. It was the look of someone protecting a secret at any cost. Marisol's back foot found nothing but open air. Time did something strange in the half-second Marisol's body tipped backward over the edge of the 42nd floor. She would later describe it, to police, to Nathaniel, to no one else ever, as feeling like the entire world had gone silent except for one sound. Her own heartbeat, impossibly loud, impossibly slow, like it was giving her 1 extra second to think even though there was nothing left to think about. Her arms flailed. Her right hand caught nothing but wind. And then, a grip, brutal and sudden, closing around her left wrist like a steel clamp. Nathaniel had covered 20 feet in less time than it should have physically taken a person to move, and he had thrown himself forward at the exact moment Marisol's balance broke, and now he was on his knees at the very edge of the unfinished floor, one hand locked around Marisol's wrist, his whole body straining backward to keep from being pulled over with her. His shoes sliding an inch, 2 inches. Across raw concrete slick with morning dew. "I've got you," he screamed, and his voice cracked in a way that no one who knew Nathaniel Calloway, calm, composed, always in control, had ever heard before. "I've got you, don't let go, Marisol, look at me." Below them, 42 stories down, the city carried on, indifferent, a smear of moving cars and tiny people who had no idea that a woman was hanging by one wrist over their entire world. Marisol's other hand scrabbled against the concrete edge, found a seam in the surface, held. 4, 3, 4, 5 seconds that felt like a lifetime folded into itself. It was only the 2 of them. Nathaniel's arm burning, his knees grinding into unforgiving concrete, Marisol's fingers white-knuckled against stone, her feet kicking uselessly against the tower's outer wall, searching for a ledge that didn't exist. "Don't let her fall." That was Vivian's voice, screaming it into the wind as if she hadn't been the one whose hands had put Marisol there in the first place. As if the last 10 seconds hadn't happened the way everyone standing on that floor had just watched them happen. The photographer had dropped his camera and was already running toward the elevator, shouting for the construction crew below. 2 workers came sprinting up the exposed stairwell, men who had spent 20 years on job sites and had never once expected a rescue like this to happen at the top of their own build. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Ray who'd worked construction since he was 19, hit the ground beside Nathaniel and grabbed Marisol's forearm with both hands. "On 3, Ray said, voice steady in a way that cut through the chaos. 1, 2, 3. They hauled her up and over the edge together, and Marisol collapsed onto the concrete, gasping, shaking so hard her teeth chattered despite the warm morning air, and Nathaniel dropped down beside her, both arms wrapped around her shoulders, holding on like he was still afraid gravity might reach out and take her anyway. "You're okay," he kept saying to her, to himself, to no one. You're okay, I've got you, you're okay." It took almost a full minute before anyone thought to look at Vivian. She was standing exactly where she'd been when she pushed, both hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face, and to anyone who hadn't been watching closely, to the photographer, to the second construction worker, to the site foreman who arrived moments later, she looked exactly like a woman in shock over a terrible accident. "I don't know what happened," Vivian said, her voice trembling beautifully. She slipped, she must have slipped, I tried to grab her, I tried." Nathaniel's head came up slowly. He hadn't had time to process what he'd actually seen. In the moment, everything had narrowed down to one instinct. Get to Marisol, get to Marisol, get to Marisol, and there had been no room in his mind for anything else. But now, kneeling on the concrete with Marisol shaking against his shoulder, the image replayed itself in his head with sudden, sickening clarity. Vivian's hands on Marisol's shoulders, driving forward. Not a slip. Not a stumble caught in a struggle. "Shove. You pushed her," he said quietly. The words landed in the open air of the 42nd floor like a physical weight. The foreman went still. Ray, still crouched near Marisol, looked up sharply. The photographer, halfway to the stairwell, froze mid-step. "Nathaniel, what?" "No." Vivian's tears kept coming, but something in her eyes had shifted, a calculation happening behind the grief. "You were 20 feet away, you can't possibly." "I saw you." His voice was very quiet now, and very cold, and it was a tone none of them had ever heard from him. "I saw your hands on her shoulders. I saw you push." "She had something of mine," Vivian said, and the moment the words left her mouth, her whole face changed, because she understood, half a second too late, exactly what she had just admitted to. Marisol, still shaking, still catching her breath, looked up at Nathaniel with wide, frightened eyes. "The folder," she whispered. "Nathaniel, there's something in the folder you need to see." The site office at the base of Meridian Tower was a converted trailer, all steel filing cabinets and rolled-up blueprints, and the smell of drip coffee that had been sitting too long. 20 minutes after Marisol had been pulled back from the edge of the 42nd floor, 6 people were crowded inside it. Nathaniel, Marisol, Vivian, the foreman, Ray, and, because someone had had the presence of mind to call him, Nathaniel's longtime attorney, Daniel Osei, who happened to already be on site finalizing the inspection paperwork Marisol had been sent to deliver in the first place. The folder sat on the table between them, and inside it, beneath the inspection contracts, was a single sheet of paper that had nothing to do with concrete or steel or building permits at all. It was a printed email chain. Marisol had found it 2 days earlier, tucked inside a drawer in Nathaniel's home office while she was reorganizing files at his request. He'd asked her to help him find an old contract, and in the process of searching, she'd come across a folder labeled, innocuously, "Personal Vit." She hadn't meant to read it. She told them that 3 times, her voice small, apologetic, as if she were the one on trial here instead of the woman who just tried to kill her. But the folder had been sitting open on the desk, and the first line of the top email had caught her eye before she could stop herself, and after that, she couldn't not read the rest. The emails were between Vivian and a man named Marcus Feld, a name Nathaniel recognized instantly, because Marcus Feld was the lead structural consultant Callaway Group had hired 6 months earlier to conduct the final safety inspection on Meridian Tower before its grand opening. The emails, dated over the past 3 weeks, laid out an arrangement in language that tried and failed to sound businesslike. Marcus would sign off on the tower's structural inspection early, weeks ahead of the actual completion of certain load-bearing reinforcements on floors 30 through 35, allowing Callaway Group to open leasing and secure a massive early occupancy bonus from the city that had been built into the original development contract. In exchange, once Vivian and Nathaniel were married and she had access to joint accounts and decision-making authority over Callaway Group's real estate portfolio. Access she'd have as his wife, per the terms of his father's estate, which required Nathaniel to be married before he could take full independent control of the company. A significant consulting fee would be paid to Marcus quietly through a shell account. Daniel Osei read the emails twice, his face going pale. "This isn't just fraud," he said slowly. "If those floors aren't fully reinforced and the building opens for occupancy anyway, Nathaniel, people could die. This is criminal falsification of a structural inspection report on an occupied high-rise." Nathaniel hadn't said a single word since sitting down. He was staring at the paper like it belonged to someone else's life. "Why?" he finally said, not looking up. "Why would you need to rush the inspection at all? The building isn't even fully financed yet. We don't need the occupancy bonus for another 8 months. "You don't," Vivian said. Her tears had dried up entirely now. Something harder had settled into her face, the mask finally, fully gone. "But I do. There are people I owe money to, Nathaniel. A lot of money. From before you and I ever met. I needed the bonus to clear it before anyone found out, before it became your problem, before it became public, before it embarrassed you, embarrassed the company. Or before it made you not worth marrying," Marisol said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. But it was true, and everyone in that trailer knew it, including most painfully Nathaniel. Vivian's jaw tightened. "You don't get to speak in this conversation. You're the housekeeper. She's the reason 200 families aren't going to move into a building with unreinforced floors," Daniel Osei snapped, sliding the emails into a folder of his own. "Vivian, I have to be honest with you. I have an ethical and legal obligation to report this, and given what just happened 42 stories up, I strongly suggest you have a lawyer of your own by the end of the day." Nathaniel finally lifted his head. When he looked at Vivian, there was no anger left in his face, just a kind of exhausted grief, the specific grief of watching 4 months of a life you thought you were building turn out to have been built on nothing at all. "You were going to let me marry you," he said, "so that you could bury a debt using my company's money, on a building where you were willing to fake the safety of load-bearing floors that hold up an entire tower full of future tenants. And when a member of my household staff found out, someone who has done nothing but take care of every part of my life for 3 years without ever asking for anything in return, you tried to throw her off the roof." "I panicked," Vivian said, and for the first time, her voice actually cracked with something that sounded like real fear. "Nathaniel, I love you. Get out," he said. "Get off my site. Ray, can you make sure Ms. Hale gets safely down to the ground floor and off the premises?" Ray, who 40 minutes earlier had helped pull Marisol back from the edge of a 42-story fall, stood up without hesitation. As Vivian was led out of the trailer, she looked back once, not at Nathaniel but at Marisol. "This isn't over," she said. She had no idea in that moment exactly how wrong she was about that. The next 6 weeks changed the shape of Nathaniel Callaway's entire life, though not in the way anyone standing in that trailer could have predicted. Vivian Hale was arrested 11 days later. Not for the assault, though that charge came too, but for wire fraud and conspiracy to falsify a structural safety inspection. Once Marcus Feld, facing his own mounting legal exposure, agreed to cooperate fully with investigators rather than go down alone. The story made local news for a few days. Billionaire's fiancée arrested in skyscraper safety scandal. Nathaniel refused every interview request. He had Meridian Tower's entire structural inspection redone from scratch, at a personal cost that made his accountant physically wince, and he made sure, personally walking the floors himself with a new inspection team, that every single load-bearing point in that building was sound before he would allow a single tenant to sign a lease. But the part of those 6 weeks that actually mattered to him, the part that kept him up at night in a way the fraud investigation never did, was much smaller and much quieter than any headline. It was the fact that Marisol had almost died protecting information that wasn't even about her, for a man who, if he was honest with himself, and grief has a way of forcing honesty, had spent 3 years accepting her care as though it were simply part of the furniture of his life. He'd never once asked her about her son's school, though he vaguely knew Matteo existed. He'd never asked what she did on her 1 day off a week, or whether the commute from her apartment was manageable, or whether the salary he paid her actually covered what it cost to raise a child alone in this city. He had let a woman quietly hold his entire life together for 3 years and had never once turned around to look at who was doing the holding. He started slowly to look. Began small. He asked Marisol genuinely how Matteo was doing in school, and was startled to learn the boy was gifted in math, 2 grade levels ahead, and that Marisol had been quietly saving for years toward a tutoring program she couldn't quite afford yet on her own. He didn't write a check and hand it to her. He understood somewhere in the last 6 weeks that this wasn't a transaction. Instead, he asked if Matteo might like to sit in, sometime, with a small team of structural engineers currently re-inspecting Meridian Tower, the ones who used the exact kind of math Matteo loved, on a real building for real reasons. Marisol had cried when she said yes, though she tried very hard not to let him see it. He gave her a raise that reflected what her work had actually been worth for 3 years, not what he'd been comfortable paying. He didn't frame it as charity, and she didn't accept it as charity. She'd earned every dollar of it 100 times over, and they both knew it. And slowly, without either of them naming it out loud, something else began to shift too. Not a whirlwind romance, nothing sudden or performative, but a kind of quiet gravity. Nathaniel found himself, more days than not, seeking out Marisol at the end of the day, not to ask her to do anything, but just to sit in the same room while she made Matteo's dinner or graded his homework at the kitchen table, and to feel, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like his house actually felt like a home. Vivian's trial began 4 months later, and Marisol was called as a witness. She sat in the courtroom in a plain gray dress, hands folded in her lap, and told the truth exactly as it had happened. The folder, the emails, the shove, the 42 stories of empty air beneath her feet. She did not exaggerate. She did not perform grief or fear for the jury. She simply told them what had happened, in the same steady, dignified voice she used for everything. And somehow that plainness landed harder in the room than any dramatics could have. Vivian's lawyer tried, on cross-examination, to paint Marisol as an opportunist. A housekeeper who had seen a chance to insert herself into a billionaire's life and taken it, who had perhaps exaggerated the push into something more than an unfortunate accident born of a scuffle over paperwork. "Ms. Vega," the lawyer said, "isn't it true that you've grown quite close to Mr. Calloway since this incident?" "Yes," Marisol said simply. "Wouldn't you agree that gives you a motive to embellish what happened that day?" Marisol looked at him for a long moment. "I have raised my son alone for 9 years," she said. "I have worked in that household for 3 of them, and in 3 years, I never once asked Mr. Calloway for anything beyond my wages. I did not need to invent anything that happened on that rooftop. I need only tell you what I felt, which was Ms. Hale's hands on my shoulders, and then nothing beneath my feet but 42 floors of open air. I have not slept fully through a night since. I do not need a motive to tell the truth. I only needed to survive long enough to tell it." The courtroom was silent for a long moment after that. Vivian was convicted on all counts: assault, wire fraud, conspiracy to falsify a public safety document. 6 weeks later, she was sentenced to 8 years. By the time Meridian Tower held its actual grand opening, Nearly a year after the day Marisol had almost fallen from its unfinished 42nd floor, it looked nothing like the building it had been that morning. It was finished now, glass and steel gleaming against the skyline, every load-bearing floor triple inspected and certified, 240 apartments and a dozen retail spaces ready for a city that had watched its entire dramatic construction story unfold on the local news. Nathaniel stood at the base of the building the morning of the opening, looking up at it, and thought, not for the first time, about how close the whole thing had come to being something else entirely. A building with hidden structural danger inside it, dedicated to a marriage built on the same kind of hidden danger. He thought about how thin the line had been that day, between the version of his life where he never found out the truth, and the version where he did. Marisol found him there, Matteo trailing behind her in a small suit he'd insisted on wearing for the occasion, because the engineers had invited him. Genuinely invited him, not as a favor, to help cut the ribbon alongside Nathaniel, in recognition of the fact that the boy had spent the last 8 months quietly absorbing more structural engineering theory from the reinspection team than most college freshmen. "You didn't have to give him that," Marisol said, watching Matteo practice his handshake with one of the junior engineers. "The ribbon. The recognition. I didn't give it to him," Nathaniel said. "He earned it. The same way you earned everything I've finally started giving you credit for." Marisol was quiet for a moment. "I used to think," she said, "that being invisible was the safest way to survive. Do your job well. Don't ask for anything. Don't be seen too much because being seen means being a target. I've lived that way my whole life. And now I think," she said slowly, "that the day I almost fell off this building was also, somehow, the day I stopped being invisible. And I'm still trying to understand how something so terrifying turned into the best thing that ever happened to me and my son." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, and something in his chest, something that had been slowly rebuilding itself for a year, floor by floor, alongside the tower in front of them, settled fully into place. "Maybe," he said, "it's because the people who deserve to be seen the most are usually the ones who spend their whole lives making sure everyone else gets seen first." The morning of the ribbon cutting, a small crowd had gathered. City officials, tenants who'd already moved in during the soft opening, a few local reporters who'd covered the scandal a year earlier and were curious to see how the story ended. Ray was there too, standing near the front in his good jacket, the same man who had once dropped to his knees on raw concrete and helped pull a woman back from the edge of a 42-story fall. When it came time for the ribbon cutting, Nathaniel surprised everyone, including Marisol, by handing her the ceremonial scissors instead of taking them for himself. "I think this building owes its life more to you than to me," he said, loud enough for the small crowd to hear. If Marisol Vega hadn't held onto that folder, hadn't survived what happened on this building's 42nd floor, hadn't had the courage to tell the truth in a courtroom afterward, there is a real chance this tower would have opened with structural flaws in 5 of its floors, in a building meant to house 240 families. This building stands today, safely, because of her. Marisol, stunned, looked down at Matteo, who was beaming up at her with the kind of pride that made her throat tighten. "Go on, Mom," he whispered. "You always tell me to do hard things even when I'm scared." She cut the ribbon. The applause that followed wasn't loud or dramatic. It was warm, genuine, the kind of applause that comes from people who understand they're witnessing something quietly important rather than performatively grand. A woman who had spent years being overlooked was finally, fully seen. In the weeks after the opening, life at the Calloway household, because that was what it had genuinely become, a household rather than simply a residence with staff, settled into a rhythm neither Nathaniel nor Marisol had quite expected, but both had, somewhere along the way, started to hope for. Matteo enrolled that fall in an accelerated math and science program that Nathaniel quietly funded a scholarship track for. Not just for Matteo, but for a dozen other kids from families who couldn't otherwise afford it, because Nathaniel had learned, finally, that the difference between a life like his and a life like Marisol's had very little to do with what people deserved and everything to do with what doors happened to be open to them. Marisol was no longer staff. She had, at her own insistence, transitioned into a role helping run a small foundation Nathaniel established, the Meridian Foundation, focused on funding safety oversight for construction projects in underserved neighborhoods, the kind of buildings that rarely got the kind of triple inspection Meridian Tower had ultimately received, because nobody rich or powerful had almost died on their unfinished floors to force the issue. "You could have called it anything," Marisol told him once, reading over the foundation's charter documents at his kitchen table. Her kitchen table too now, in every way that mattered. "Why name it after the building?" "Because that building is the reason I finally understood what actually matters," Nathaniel said. "I spent my whole life thinking legacy meant glass and steel with my father's name on it. Turns out it meant something a lot smaller, and a lot more important than that." There is a version of this story, the version that almost happened on a windy morning 42 stories above the city, where Marisol Vega's name never makes the news at all. Where a folder of paperwork gets pushed just slightly harder, where a hand closes half a second too late around a wrist, where a building opens on schedule with dangerously unreinforced floors and nobody ever finds out until it's far too late for 240 families who trusted that someone somewhere had checked. That version of the story is the one that haunts Nathaniel Calloway most. Even now, even a year later, even with Vivian Hale serving her sentence and Meridian Tower standing safe and certified against the skyline. He thinks about it sometimes at night, watching Marisol help Mateo with his homework at the kitchen table, the two of them bent over a math problem with a closeness that makes his own chest ache with something he still doesn't fully have words for. He thinks about how close he came to losing her, not just to a fall, but to a version of his own life where he never really saw her at all, where 3 years of quiet devotion simply continued invisibly forever, unacknowledged, until one day she simply wasn't there anymore and he never understood what he'd actually lost. "You're doing the thinking face again," Marisol said one evening, not looking up from Mateo's algebra homework. "Just grateful," Nathaniel said. "For all of it. Even the terrible parts." "Especially the terrible parts," Marisol said. "They're usually the ones that show you the truth." A year and a half after the day Marisol Vega nearly fell 42 stories from the unfinished floor of Meridian Tower, she stood on that same floor again. Finished now, glass walls installed, the wind that had once howled freely through open steel now held safely outside where it belonged. Nathaniel had asked her to meet him there alone at sunset, and when she stepped off the elevator, she found the entire floor, now a private event space at the top of the tower, lit with hundreds of small lights, and Nathaniel standing near the exact spot where he had once dropped to his knees and refused to let go of her wrist. "I know this spot has a complicated history," he said when she reached him, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the view. "But I wanted to change what it means. I wanted the last thing that happened here to be something worth remembering, instead of something we're both still trying to survive." He got down on one knee, deliberately this time on solid, finished, fully inspected ground, and asked her to marry him. Marisol Vega, who had spent most of her life believing that safety meant staying invisible, said yes, in a voice that didn't shake at all. They were married the following spring, in a small ceremony that included Mateo standing proudly at his mother's side, and Ray, the construction worker who'd helped save her life, seated in the second row in his good jacket, exactly where he belonged. The lesson in all of it, if there is one, is this: the people who hold our lives together quietly, without ever asking for recognition, are so often the ones we're most at risk of overlooking completely, right up until the moment we almost lose them. Don't wait for the edge of a rooftop to finally see the people who have been holding you up the whole time. See them now. Thank them now. Because sometimes the difference between a tragedy and a beginning is simply whether someone was paying enough attention to reach out in time. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this one, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.